In Vatican Council II, Constitution on the Church, 1964, it instructs politicians to use their secular offices to advance the cause of Roman Catholicism. Catholic laypersons, quote, whoever they are called upon to expend all their energy for the growth of the Church and its continuation and its continuous sanctification, unquote, and, quote, to make the Church present and operative in those places and circumstances where only through them can it become the salt of the earth, unquote. Vatican II further instructs all Catholics, quote, by their competence in secular disciplines and by their activity to vigorously contribute their efforts so that the goods of this world may be more equitably distributed among all men, and may in their own way be conducive to universal progress in human and Christian freedom, and to remedy the customs and conditions of the world. If they are an inducement to sin, so that they all may be conformed to the norms of justice and may favor the practice of virtue rather than hinder it, unquote. It's from Article 4, Paragraph 36 of Vatican II. And then Vatican II affirms Catholic doctrine dating back to 1302, when Pope Boniface VIII asserted that, quote, it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff, unquote. This was the inspiration for the papacy to create the United States of America that materialized in 1776 by a process just as secret as the Reagan-Vatican production of Eastern Europe in 1989. What? American government Roman Catholic from the beginning? Consider the land known today as the District of Columbia bore the name Rome, quote-unquote, in 1663 property records, and the branch of the Potomac River that bordered Rome on the south was called Tiber. This information was reported in the 1902 edition of the Catholic Encyclopedia's article on Daniel Carroll. The article specifically declaring itself, quote, of interest to Catholics, unquote, in the 1902 edition, but was deleted from the New Catholic Encyclopedia in 1967. Other facts were reported in 1902 and deleted from 1967. Yeah, you had a new Vatican Council, and for the public to accept the aspect that there has been a change in the church systems, they needed to discard some of its history, or change it, or just totally remove it. And so that's why certain things were taken out of the certain editions of encyclopedias and these type of things. And this is just one prime example. For example, when Congress met in Washington for the first time in November 1800, the only two really comfortable and imposing houses within the bounds of the city belonged to Roman Catholics. One was Washington's first mayor, Robert Brent. The other was Brent's brother-in-law, Notley Young, a Jesuit priest. Daniel Carroll was a Roman Catholic congressman from Maryland who signed two of America's fundamental documents, the Articles of Confederation and the United States Constitution. Carroll was a direct descendant of the Calverts, a Catholic family to whom King Charles I of England had granted Maryland as a feudal barony. Carroll had received his education at St. Omer's Jesuit College in Flanders, where young English-speaking Catholics were trained in a variety of guerrilla techniques for advancing the cause of Roman Catholicism among hostile Protestants. In 1790, President George Washington, a Protestant, appointed Congressman Carroll to head a commission of 3 men to select land for the federal city, quote-unquote, called for in the Constitution. Of all places, the commission chose Rome, which at the time consisted of 4 farms, one of which belonged to Daniel Carroll. It was upon Carroll's farm that the new government chose to erect its most important building, the Capitol. We're not going to get into the Capitol here, but I just want to go over some of these quotes and these types of things because this is going to lead into our next chapter in Grand Design Exposed. Because there's going to be some very conflicting history that's not going to seem right to you. But these things did happen. Okay? And at a time, like for example, the aspect of religious freedom, you have to ask yourself this question. If we had people from Europe fleeing religious persecution by the hands of Rome and coming over here to establish colonies, and so they may have freedom to practice their religion according to the dictates of their conscience. 98% of these people Protestant, by the way. So what need was there for religious freedom when they already had it? Why did the issue arise regarding religious freedom? And was it more political to introduce this religious freedom than it was a concern for the church? Because Protestants in the colonial period, they had their freedom. They already had it. But there was one institution that was seeking it in America. And their groundworks were in it from the very beginning. Under guises of different names, under guises of different societies and these types of things. And this is why we're going to be getting into this. So and then as some of the quotes from The Art of War states, quote, "To know your enemy, you must become your enemy. When able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near." That's out of The Art of War. And then a portion of the Supreme Oath of the Jesuits, the Superior addresses the initiate at the very beginning here. "My son," this is from the Superior, "my son, heretofore you have been taught to act the dissembler among Roman Catholics, to be a Roman Catholic, and to be a spy even among your own brethren, to believe no man, to trust no man, among the Reformers, to be a Reformer, among the Huguenots, to be a Huguenot, among the Calvinists, to be a Calvinist, among other Protestants, generally to be a Protestant, and obtaining their confidence, to seek even to preach from their pulpits, and to denounce with all the vehemence in your nature our holy religion and the Pope, and even to descend so low as to become a Jew among Jews, that you might be enabled to gather together all information for the benefit of your order as a faithful soldier of the Pope." So, and we have this framework of mind to believe that this America is a Christian nation. This America is a Protestant nation. The principles and these types of things are Protestant. And when you look at some of the political principles of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they very much seem Protestant. But as according to what the map states here, and as according to regular research, you will come to find out that at the time of 1776, which is very weird because you can look at the revolutions in France and all these other revolutions, and it sure seems like the Jesuits always have a hand to play in these revolutions. But they didn't have a hand to play in the American Revolution. There was a different strategy involved. Here you had a nation, or here you had a piece of land that people suffering persecution were coming to, establishing their colonies, establishing their faith, practicing their faith with freedom, not having to worry about turning this way or that. And then here we had a little piece of real estate called Maryland that was a Catholic colony in the midst of a Protestant landmass. And it's from that colony you get all of your laws, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, and these types of things. And now, as good as they may seem, because just as it states in Revelation 13 that this beast that rose up out of the earth, he had two horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. So this beast would appear to be a lamb-like beast. It's like a lamb. Doesn't mean it is a lamb. And in the midst of that observance, we see something that looks like it is of a Protestant standpoint. After all, and prior to 1776, Catholics were very much shunned in the colonial period. So who would be wanting to enforce and promote this idea of religious freedom? Those that don't have it and need it, or those that already have it and don't need it? Thus begins Chapter 8 of the Grand Design Exposed. This is why I wanted to come at you with the beginning of this chapter, leading up to this chapter, because there are some things that are going to be said that is going to be mind-boggling, but it's proven in history. It's history that's been left out, but it's out there and you can research it. So let's go ahead and get started with the next reading. And now we begin Chapter 8 of the Grand Design Exposed, called the Catholic Maryland Colony. And this is a pretty lengthy chapter, so this might have to be split up into two parts. There's a lot of information in this chapter, so we're just going to have to dive right down to it and get down to the meat of this very unique history. This chapter is well over 20 pages, so, as I stated, we're going to have to split this chapter up into probably 2 videos at least. So Chapter 8, the Catholic Maryland Colony, out of the Grand Design Exposed, by John Daniel. Laying the groundwork. Now it was for quite some time set in the heart of King James I the marrying of his son Charles, then heir to the throne, to the Princess of Spain. This unpopular effort at royal matchmaking, doomed from the first to failure, was also very much looked forward to by King James I's Secretary of State, George Calvert. As a Roman Catholic, Calvert saw the advent of a queen of his own faith as likely to be of considerable advantage to him. When it became known that the marriage negotiations had failed, the Spanish party, as the few court sympathizers were called, among whom George Calvert was most conspicuous, fell into immediate disgrace. With his political future wrecked, he placed his resignation in the hands of the king, and as a way of escape and a door of hope to retrieve his fallen fortunes, he looked across the seas to the island of Newfoundland. He could there take possession of land which was already his and establish a prosperous plantation. King James I died March 25th in 1625. His son Charles I then reigned until 1649. George Calvert sailed into his Newfoundland colony in August of 1627, 2 years after the death of James I. Newfoundland was not regarded as a very desirable place, whether for settlements or investment. The harsh Newfoundland winters convinced George Calvert that this was not the place he could make his fortunes. So he left Newfoundland, never to return, like closing the chapter on that part of his life. He sailed south into the James River and colony of Virginia. October of 1629. Now here we see the vision, so to speak, of a Catholic colony, because after all, George Calvert was a devout Roman Catholic, and he had property in Newfoundland, and because of the harsh winters of Newfoundland, he now decides to venture south into the colony of Virginia in October of 1629. His eyes, beholding the lushness of Virginia, were in stark contrast from where he had just been. His mind was made up. Virginia was the place he would found his new colony. Once again, George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, is back in England. He makes his wishes known to King Charles I, even though the land he covets is already occupied by Virginian colonists. The Virginians had received him kindly and treated him with the utmost consideration, yet he hesitated not only to beg for their land, but to go to very considerable trouble to deprive them of it. This was the atmosphere that began Lord Baltimore's colony of Maryland. So here were these Virginian colonists who received George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, kindly and treated him with the utmost consideration. Now, again, you have to think of the strategy here. Is it possible that these Virginian colonists didn't know that George Calvert was a Roman Catholic? Because in the majority, if not all of the colonies, had bans on practicing superstitious religion out in public view. It was not allowed. So here is this Calvert who just comes in, but yet these Virginians receive him kindly and treat him with the utmost consideration. Did he not possibly put aside his Catholicism in order to garner the praise of the people? You ever hear the phrase, give the devil an inch and he'll take a mile? Got to remember, 98% of this land was Protestant. So how did this happen? By going through a different means of strategy. As regards King Charles I's part in the transaction, it has been rightly characterized, quote, a more iniquitous and unjust piece of business never stained Charles I's reign. An English nobleman sets foot upon a colony in which his countrymen are already settled, surveys the vastness and fertility of its territory, finds that he is prohibited, alike by the laws of the province and of his native country, from obtaining his object unless he takes the oath of supremacy. Refusing to take that oath, he returns to England and secures, through his influence at court and his personal friendship with the king, property and privileges within the borders of the desired land, far greater than had been conferred upon any British subject. Unquote. Being a Roman Catholic nobleman in the presence of a sympathetic king had its great advantages. In Protestant England, it had its pitfalls too. Before George Calvert, the first Baron of Baltimore, could reap his rewards, there was a reaper of another kind that had marked George Calvert for his own. The 15th of April, 1632, at the early age of 52, a worn-out man before his time, he passed away, bequeathing his worthless estates in Newfoundland, and all his Irish and English property, together with his expectations in Maryland, to Cecilius, his eldest son. In memory of George Calvert, the first Baron of Baltimore, there is an interesting legend, of Roman Catholic origin, of course, that Sir George Calvert sought and obtained from King Charles I his charter of Maryland for the purpose and desire to found a colony where religious liberty, sternly prohibited and under ban elsewhere, should find in at least one place in all the world protection and a home for true religious toleration. A Roman Catholic aristocrat? A preacher of religious toleration? But the legend goes on to say that, although stricken down himself by the hand of death before he could fulfill his splendid purpose, that purpose still lived on, destined to a glorious fulfillment. So, the purpose of this colony, according to this legend, was to promote religious liberty, which was sternly prohibited and under ban elsewhere. Well, what form of religious liberty was banned? What was banned that Calvert wanted to champion in this new colony? It was a superstitious religion. It was Roman Catholicism. Because they knew that you give just a little inkling of a foothold, then they will take it and they will run with it. And that's exactly what happened. So again, I'm going to read this paragraph over. In memory of George Calvert, the first Baron of Baltimore, there is an interesting legend of Roman Catholic origin, of course, that Sir George Calvert sought and obtained from King Charles I his charter of Maryland for the purpose and desire to found a colony where religious liberty, sternly prohibited and under ban elsewhere, should find, in at least one place in all the world, protection and a home for true religious toleration. And this is basically, this was basically the carrot that was dangled in front of all the other colonies. without giving an inkling of evidence that this could dare be a Catholic plot. But the legend goes on to say that although stricken down himself by the hand of death before he could fulfill his splendid purpose, that purpose still lived on, destined to a glorious fulfillment. Wow, what a saintly halo this man must have worn on his brow. But history sees him in a different light, not as a philosopher, a pilgrim father, nor even a public benefactor, but instead a politician, a merchant, and an adventurer. There is another interesting fact, this time almost a marvel, about this great benefactor to the Christian world and Maryland. Search as you may, but you will not find a single public memorial that exists in Christendom to remind them, in a too forgetful world, of Sir George Calvert's benevolence. Most of all, we are astonished at this neglect in Maryland. But imagine it. Go through Baltimore streets and squares and see those who have served their country. Orators, statesmen, generals, judges, poets, are all suitably remembered. But Sir George Calvert's memorial is nowhere to be found. The first preacher of liberty of conscience, unhonored in Baltimore? And comprehend this. Leonard Calvert, son of George Calvert and Cecilia Calvert's brother, who he appointed the first governor of Maryland, lies in a nameless grave. His sepulchre no man knows unto this day. What could be the reason for this lack of honor? The legend of Maryland is pure fiction, for in George Calvert's day, the duty of tolerating religious error was a part of no man's creed. No preacher of true toleration had yet arisen among men, nor was the world ready for such a prophet. Neither the Church of England, the Puritans, and certainly not the Roman Catholics believed in religious liberty at that time. Now, granted, why do you think the Puritans, just think of the Puritans now. Why do you think the Puritans did not believe in religious liberty at that time? Because you give religious liberty, that means you're not just giving religious liberty to the Christian faith, you're giving religious liberty to all. And you give the devil an inch, he will take a mile. Regardless of the population of the favored religion. He would so cloak himself in order to meet his ends, which justifies the means. Each believed, as was handed down from Mother Rome, in a state church established by law, and each was intent on establishing its own faith to the exclusion of every other. It took another 30 years before a colony was founded on quote-unquote true religious liberty. Roger Williams and John Clark, a Baptist preacher, obtained their charter for Rhode Island in 1663. Baptists, or Anabaptists as they were called, suffered horrendously from both Catholics and Protestants alike. Roger Williams, who was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony by Protestants too entrenched in Romanism to even understand the true principles of religious freedom, ordered in the Rhode Island colony, quote, that no man should be molested for his conscience, unquote, arguing what government had the right to persecute him for his religious opinions. 8 years later, William Penn established in 1681 his colony in Pennsylvania as a refuge for the Society of Friends, known also as Quakers. Maryland and the legend of Maryland, both destined to a glorious fulfillment, was being guided by the Jesuits for a definite purpose. English colonies in the New World, even though some fiercely opposed the Church of England, wanting to purify it, were nevertheless Protestant in nature. all except one, and that was the colony of Maryland. So Protestant in nature. Remember how when you look at the term Protestant, you have it has both of a negative and a positive meaning. Okay, and obviously the negative meaning was the protesting of the Roman Church system, the Antichrist and these types of things. But the positive meaning was the fruit of which Protestants of Protestantism is founded on, and you can see some of the fruits being expounded on in the form of capitalistic type societies and these types of things, which were directly influenced by the Reformation, and these types of things. So, but that doesn't mean that they were staunch Bible believers, okay? But, Protestant in nature, Protestant in principle, all the colonies were, except for the colony of Maryland. The proprietaries of Maryland were Roman Catholic. So was its first governor. The Calverts became a useful tool in the Jesuits' hands, leading to a life and death struggle between them. Yet this opportunity now quickly opened for Rome and her Jesuits to begin the groundwork for their grand design. The rest is history, as it records how the Maryland area was developed and became the seat and capital of the world's greatest power, the United States of America, or quote-unquote, New Rome. What Scriptures calls the likeness or image to Rome, the beast. This will be explained in a later chapter. The history of Maryland that we are about to study is documented and preserved in the Maryland Historical Society. Also, there will be quotes directly from the 1907 to 1914 15-volume Catholic Encyclopedia. To many, history might be dry and boring. Yet if we have a burning desire to understand what is truth, then history becomes vibrant and alive. History sheds light on our present world and also gives understanding for the future. It is through history that we find our roots, and has become the reason and object of why much of our history today has been thoroughly censored, so that our roots will be purposely obscured. Cecilius Calvert, a man of business. 2 months after Sir George Calvert's death, on the 20th of June, 1632, a charter was issued, written in Latin, the only one of the colonial charters of which the original was in that language. It finally passed the Great Seal of England, with no other changes in its wording than the substitution of the name of Cecilius in place of his father's. The king was firm for naming it Maryland, or Terra Mariae. Virginia memorialized the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth, and Maryland should memorialize his own beloved Catholic Queen, daughter of Henry IV of France, so that side by side in the New World there should be the twin memorials of the two English queens. Cecilius Calvert, the second Baron of Baltimore, was the very man Maryland needed, for he was a clear-headed man of business, giving his chief attention to business rather than religion. The area where he and the Jesuits clashed, not that he was an irreligious man. The task before him was stupendous. A province of 8 million acres, an area much larger than Maryland is today. We find him with great promptness and vigor, rousing public attention to the golden opportunities. No matter what station a man was in life, profits were absolutely sure. The grandest descriptions were given to induce emigrants, a country abundantly rich in rivers, fish, mighty oaks, wild fruits and berries, wild animals and fowls, a soil so rich the seed in the worst years yielded 200-fold, and moreover, the soil afforded 3 harvests a year. One would have almost supposed that an appeal as this would have been very disastrous in depopulating England herself, especially the Roman Catholic portion of the population, rushing, as it were, from the evil English kingdom to that land of religious toleration and material paradise. Apparently, strange as it seems, the New World held no such charms for them, for only 200 and some odd persons in all came forward in response to Cecilius Calvert's public appeal. But even more remarkable, of the 200 that came on board, the 2 ships sailing from England, over 3/4 were of the English Church, of which most of those were common people, of the noblemen on board. Roman Catholics outranked those of the English Church. The 2 ships, the Ark and the Dove, with their mixed religionist emigrants, departed Gravesend, England, on 19th of October, 1633. The Lord Proprietary Cecilius Calvert did not accompany them, nor did he ever set foot on his Maryland shores. But as they were about to depart, he gave them some wise instructions. Understanding the growing tensions between the parliamentarians and those sympathetic to Romanism, and because he was wise and business-minded enough to not have his colonial enterprise wrecked for religious reasons, he counseled them to cause all acts of Roman Catholic religion to be done as privately as may be, and that they instruct all Roman Catholics to be silent on all occasions of discourse on religion, and this to be observed at land as well as at sea. Very interesting. Well, I'm going to repeat that again. Understanding the growing tensions between the parliamentarians and those sympathetic to Romanism, and because he was wise and business-minded enough to not have his colonial enterprise wrecked for religious reasons, he counseled them to cause all acts of Roman Catholic religion to be done as privately as may be, and that they instruct all Roman Catholics to be silent on all occasions of discourse on religion, and this to be observed at land as well as at sea. This is what they were, and this Cecilius Calvert never set a foot in his Maryland colony. Gives instructions to those of the Ark and the Dove, which was intermingled with the Church of England and Roman Catholics alike, that we are not to openly practice our religion, but through our policies and these types of things, we put that aside and we advance our policies. Therefore, you can end up turning a nation into a system that they that they totally object, but now are they falling in suit for? All you have to do is get rid of the religious aspect. You bring in the political aspects. Regardless of the religious aspects, it makes no difference. It's still part and parcel to that system. With this they departed, having yet 3 more passengers to be picked up. They made one last stop at the small South English Isle of Wight. At the very outset can be seen the intentions of some of those on board. The counsel of Cecilius Calvert obviously fell on deaf ears. For the stop at the Isle of Wight was for the opportunity to smuggle on board 3 Jesuit priests. Traveling to Maryland, at first under assumed names, Jesuit Andrew White, John Alton, alias Gravenor, and a lay brother, Thomas Gervasi, were all fully conscious that they were lawbreakers and were so at their own peril. As the ship set sail on November 22nd, 1633, we find the Jesuit priests engaged in a public Roman Catholic ceremony invoking the Blessed Virgin, the saints, and the guardian angels of Maryland for protection for a safe voyage. On reaching the shores of Maryland, another very Roman Catholic ceremony was held. A great cross was hewed out of a tree, and then, being planted, the day being the day of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, on March 25th, 1634. The priest celebrated Mass, a thing which had never been done before in that part of the world. On bended knee, they recited the litanies of the Sacred Cross with great emotion, taking possession of the country for Christ and the Sovereign Lord, the King of England. This conduct of disobedience was the first of a long series of deliberate acts of disloyalty credited to the Jesuit Society in Maryland, causing great distress for Lord Baltimore and eventually the revoking of his charter. The first several years, however, went smoothly. Everyone worked at the task before them, establishing their new home. Trees were felled, fields planted, homes built, streets laid out. Everything was done in the most practical and businesslike manner. Soon the settlers were able to abandon the ships which had so long sheltered them and take up their dwelling on the land. But on the 8th of August, 1637, another group of emigrants came to the Maryland colony. Along with them was a man whose name was Thomas Copley, alias Philip Fisher, a Jesuit priest who carefully hid his priestly status so that for a time he was not suspected by the colonists. It's everything is done in secrecy when it comes to this Maryland colony. With his arrival, things changed drastically. It was chiefly due to Jesuit Thomas Copley's efforts that the few Roman Catholics who were on board the Ark and the Dove had been a part of the Maryland expedition. When Lord Baltimore advertised for emigrants, the Jesuit Society considered that it had in its new plantation a favorable opportunity of extending its influence in America under the English flag. Maryland, to be sure, offered them opportunities in this direction, denied them elsewhere. New England was forbidden territory to them, so was Virginia. The Lord Proprietary of Maryland was a Roman Catholic, and with him and his relatives, they had great influence. Why not accept the Lord Baltimore's terms and furnish him with just the settlers his province needed? The terms were good. 200 acres for every man sent out went to this successful agent. So 200 acres for every man sent out went to the successful agent. The Jesuit Society became one of Lord Baltimore's recruiting agencies. Its executive officer for this purpose was Thomas Copley. His venture as an immigration agent resulted in sending to Maryland not less than 28 persons. Jesuit Copley subsequently presented on behalf of the Jesuit Society a claim against Lord Baltimore for 6,000 acres of Maryland land. Successful, however, as it was, this process of acquiring land was too slow for Copley's energetic soul. He himself, with 19 more emigrants under his charge, was looking for 4,000 more acres of land. But soon after coming to the colony, he inaugurated so specious a scheme of securing land from the Indians that had it eventually succeeded, Baltimore would soon have no land to call his own. Acquiring land was not the only area that Jesuit Copley was aggressive in. With Copley's advent in 1637, the relations existing between the Anglicans and their Roman Catholic brethren were at once changed. Copley was of an energetic nature, and matters religiously were not moving fast enough. Following upon his arrival, the policy of the Roman Catholics suddenly became one of aggression. Work must be undertaken, more converts were needed in the colony, where it was infested with heretics. Their methods of accomplishing this were various. Chiefly, however, they sought success by vigorous efforts of proselytizing, even forcing their way into Protestant homes, by rigidly excluding Anglicans from political office, and by working the legislature in their own interests. Even though the Anglican churchmen were in the majority numerically throughout the province, many were not freemen, being either slaves or indentured servants, and by law they did not possess the right of speaking and voting upon the laws by which they were to be governed. The gentlemen, quote-unquote, in the colony of this class, the Roman Catholics, were in the majority. It was these conditions, then, at the beginning of the colony, that made the Anglican churchmen politically weak. And so when the first assembly was gathered together on a basis of freemen suffrage, even though the Anglican churchmen on actual ballots were in the majority, the Romanists were in a position to materially influence proceedings in their favor. The government is Catholic. The government is Catholic, it was said. Thus the first Maryland Assembly presented the singular spectacle of a considerable community of Englishmen subject to Roman Catholic influence at a time when the celebration of the Mass was a capital felony in England. For the first time since Mary's reign, English supporters of the papacy found themselves able to dominate a legislative assembly in their own interest. And they were not slow in taking advantage of the situation. It is incredible that the first order of business at hand was to pass the Act for Church Liberties. This act, in direct violation of English statutes, immediately but hidden effect, was to place the clergy of the Roman Church beyond control of the civil power, exempting them from taxation and many of the duties of citizenship, and enabling their church, among other things, to hold property independent of the state, a right by law, which even the English Church herself could not do. In essence, they had established the Roman Catholic Church as the religion of the state. Hardly a wise proceeding, forcing such a radical measure as this through the infant legislature, especially considering the religious climate at the time in England. And that climate was not the result of bigotry or prejudice, but like a burnt child who dreads the fire. It was just a matter of self-survival. England had had enough of Rome. Even before the Act for Church Liberties was passed, October 23rd, 1640, Lord Baltimore was receiving news informing him of the bitter feelings against the aggressive measures which had been agitated in the colony. Even worse, he received firsthand a letter from Jesuit Copley on April 3rd of 1638 of demands of very extravagant privileges and news, asking Lord Baltimore to approve the proceedings as a son of the Church. On the margin of this letter, Lord Baltimore had written, quote, "All their tenants as well as servants he intimates here ought to be accepted from the temporal government," unquote. The news came as a bombshell to Lord Baltimore. He was aghast. At the same time, affairs in England were casting dark shadows, so that however a good Romanist he was, and however anxious he may have been to further the interest of his church, he could not prudently have followed Copley's advice. Lord Baltimore knew the law, and he was without excuse if he broke it, and he had no intention of being pilloried as an example of disobedience to it, nor would he imperil his property by any ill-timed generosity. Indeed, so impartially did he act, that one would scarcely have suspected him of being a Roman Catholic at all, much to the extreme disappointment, resentment, and chagrin of the Jesuits. It was all very well for Lord Baltimore to lay down laws, but it was another thing for him to enforce them. The distance between him and his province, making communication slow and uncertain, and always irregular, bred the feeling that much could be done in which the absent lord would never hear of at all, and at any rate, if they chose a course of action contrary to his laws, months would elapse before they could ever be repudiated. And so it speedily became evident that it is one thing to give laws, and another to enforce them. When you are dealing with men who have their own purpose to serve, ignoring alike the dictates of prudence and the injunctions of Lord Baltimore, they began a contest for supremacy in Maryland, which was to end in their own undoing. And as the Jesuits chose to pursue a policy of aggression, they were overwhelmed by disaster which finally swept them away, but only temporarily. Like shooing blackbirds from your cornfield, turn your back and they always return. To purport the claim that only one organization in all the earth has the truth for man's salvation, and being an aristocratic member of that organization, sharing in the mission to extend that claim, makes for a very arrogant, bold, and aggressive person, transcending all others of their rights, human justice, and feelings. Romanism had established herself in South America, settling up her so-called reductions among the native Indians, miniature socialized communistic compounds becoming laboratories that developed today's communism. And now Rome was bent and determined to plant a Roman Catholic colony among the English on the North American continent. Rome succeeded in her Maryland glorious undertaking, but not without a fight. The sad thing with Protestantism is that they have only won battles. Rome has all but won the war. And so I think we're going to conclude today's reading in chapter 8, called The Catholic Maryland Colony. And we will pick up in the next reading by going over England's Black Clouds. So again, I want to thank you for listening. Truth be told, truth be known. Stay safe. God bless. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.